Okay, I want to start with some Ryan Getty content. Uh, I like political compass meme videos. I was just wondering what axes he'd use for his, where he'd categorize people. I wanted to go over his populism video because I've already watched that one, but I thought it'd be good to react to because I don't quite agree with his definitions of populism. Um, Wanted to get into why I think his differs from what a really useful definition of populism should be. Because, one thing I think about often is normative loading and when it's appropriate and when it isn't. And a lot of times people like to load normative concepts onto things that are just descriptive, you know, and it really detracts from your understanding of what that thing is. But at the same time, people can also extract a lot of the normative content from other terminology and to sort of try to take advantage of whatever positive sentiment might exist, you know, in that terminology. And I feel like populism is one of those words. Like, there's a lot of inherent normative content in the word populism, I believe. I mean, of course, that definition can shift based on how people use it, but I think based on the mainstream definition of the word, there's a lot of normative content in the term that a lot of people try to strip out from it to sort of take advantage of the aspects that make it appealing. But there are plenty of things that are appealing that have a lot of sort of what we would consider negative aspects to them. And populism, I believe, is in that category of things. So yeah, let's take a look at his political compass video first, and then we can get into the populism stuff
The
afterwards.
political compass is a staple of online politics. I've adapted this concept for different things on my channel before, ranking stuff on various X and Y axes, but the political compass isn't the only quiz for politics out there. In fact, there's all kinds of charts and quizzes and graphs and diagrams that aim to help people understand politics better. If you're watching this channel, I bet you've taken more than one political quiz, but not all quizzes and ways of organizing people's political worldviews are created equal, which is why I have created what I'm calling the political compass, which is going to help you understand all the different political quizzes, charts, spectrums, diagrams, and what have you that you might run into online. Since this, of course, is done in the traditional compass format, we have two axes, the complexity axis and the intention axis. Some ways of organizing or thinking about politics are more complex than others. The more complex a way of organizing politics is, the higher it will be on the chart. Additionally, sometimes the purpose of a political quiz or a chart is to help people understand their own positions, and sometimes the purpose of a quiz or a chart is to challenge the way that you think about politics, or even present a wholly alternative framework for thinking about politics. Stuff that I think is mostly just trying to sort is further to the left, and stuff that's trying more to make a point is further to the right. But that's enough explanation, right? In the center of our compass, we have, of course, the traditional political compass, because of course, where else could I put it? But let's put a pin in that for now, and instead take a look at the bottom middle of our chart towards the most basic.
Okay, I missed a little bit of what he said
Stuff
there.
that I think is mostly just trying to sort is further to the left, and stuff that's
Okay.
trying more to make a point is further to the right. But that's enough explanation, right? In the center of our compass, we have, of course, the traditional political compass, because of course, where else could I put it? But
Okay, so on the left, he's going to have more of the descriptive terminology, like basically, I guess, the methodology of enacting whatever your political ideology is, the tools in your toolbox, I guess. And the right would be some of the more value oriented aspects. So things you believe and the goals you hope to achieve with the ideology. Okay. Seems like a pretty good sorting.
let's put a pin in that for now, and instead take a look at the bottom middle of our chart towards the most basic form of political organization there is, the left-right political spectrum. The political spectrum aims to place people on a line from the farthest right to the farthest left. The ones that you find online will typically put communism or sometimes left-wing anarchism on the far left with fascism on the far right. And in the middle, you'll see things like social democracy, conservatism, classical liberalism, stuff like that. Sometimes you'll see people say that the classic political spectrum is centered around economics. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's certainly not true to how the political spectrum was originally used. The origins of our left-right political divide go all the way back to revolutionary France. Check out my French Revolution political compass too, by the way. I won't go explaining the whole French Revolution, but the context you need to know for this discussion is that the French revolutionaries were sharply divided over what kind of government France should have after the revolution. Should there be a republic with no king, like the, at that time, new United States? a constitutional monarchy where the king still has some powers but is limited by an elected assembly, kind of like Great Britain at the time? Or should France just keep the monarchy and its old feudal structure, the ancien regime? In the National Assembly, which is where the representatives in France were meeting to discuss these questions, people who supported a republic or a more limited role for the king, people who supported the revolution, basically sat on the left side of the assembly. Representatives who supported the monarchy and opposed all this revolution business sat on the right side of the National Assembly. So I think, contrary to some of the folk wisdom out there about the left-right political spectrum, it's always been bound up in more than just economics. One other interesting thing about the origins of our left-right spectrum is that the fringe
Yeah, I think you could say it's also bound up in, because what role does the economic view in the left right spectrum play, right? It has to do with distribution of resources, right? So you can think of left and right as views of optimal modes of distribution of power. um, I think the further left you are, people would typically say you want power to be more distributed among the populace. The further right you are, you want power to be more concentrated in the hands of some form of elite, whether it's based on heredity, wealth, ethnicity, etc. Some form of concentrated power by people who you believe are more worthy to exercise or to hold that power. And the further left you get, the more you want power to be distributed among the populace. So wealth comes into that because economic concentration also determines how power is distributed. You know, you have a certain amount of what people call utility or capacity, or even just capital, based on how much wealth uh, you have at your command. So that's why wealth tends to, what people's views on wealth also tend to stratify, you know, left and right, similarly to the way people view power. So I'd say the economic views of the left right political spectrum are sort of run parallel, or I guess have correlation to people's view on power itself.
Revolution may have also given us our first two-spectrum political compass. The Revolutionary Assembly had stadium-style benches that got higher up towards the back of the assembly. The radical Jacobins, like Robespierre and his allies, were given the nickname the Mountain because they liked to sit on the highest benches in the assembly. The more moderate members of the assembly were called the Plain or the Marsh because they sat on the lowest benches. So we not only get a left-right spectrum, but also a sort of radical versus moderate spectrum out of revolutionary France. But anyway, this basic left-right political spectrum has been criticized for all sorts of reasons. Here's just one example I've seen before, having to do with how to classify libertarians. Libertarians are typically very committed to free markets, but also who typically have a very live and let live attitude towards social issues. Where should we put them on a one spectrum political compass? In the middle, putting libertarians in a place also occupied by normal centrists seems to miss something important about libertarians. But anyway, every other chart that we're going to talk about for the rest of this video attempts to take one of the criticisms of this basic left-right political spectrum and correct for it in some way. And with that, I think we can finally move on to the classic four-quadrant, two-axis political compass. The team that makes the political compass on politicalcompass.org describes their intent for the project on their About page, saying, "Our essential point is that left and right, although far from obsolete, are essentially a measure of economics. As political establishments adopt either enthusiastically or reluctantly the prevailing economic orthodoxy, the neoliberal strain of capitalism, the left-right division between mainstream parties becomes increasingly blurred. Instead, party differences tend to be more about identity issues. In the narrowing debate, our social scale is more crucial than ever." Again, I can't do a whole digression about what
Man, like this whole, I feel like neoliberal is just one of the worst political terms to come out of the last 30 to 50 years. I guess it's a pretty old term. It's from around the late 60s, early 70s, but the way it's bandied about as a propaganda tool for people who reside on the further extremes of the political spectrum, both the far left and far right, is uh, so stupid. It basically has zero descriptive utility, and it's purely a normative term, even though it's technically a descriptive tool describing people's views on economic organization. Um, like there is credence to the thought about people having a neoliberal philosophy on economics, but I don't think I really don't think most people who would fall within the center right, center left, maybe more people on the center right, but a lot of people on the center left, you really could not describe them as neoliberals because they are not maximalist on the concept of markets solving for societal problems. Because really, that's what's at the core of neoliberal philosophy, that if you allow markets to maximally proliferate with some degree of intervention, they will solve for a lot of geopolitical issues, social issues, distribution issues, and you only intervene to the degree that is needed to prevent abuse and to properly account for externalities. I don't think most people on the center left have that view of market economics. I think most people on the center left think that markets are real and you ignore market forces at your peril, but you do not leave markets to develop and function on their own. They do require societal intervention, and they do require alignment to the goals and needs of various stakeholders in society, whether they're direct participants in those markets or not. So, this bandying about of the term neoliberal to describe people, uh, I mainly have a problem with it on the center left because, I think most people on the center right would align with a neoliberal economic framework. You do have some people who consider themselves right who are more protectionist, although that's pretty ahistorical. That's more of a far right thing, as you can see exemplified with the MAGA movement. But you do have the rare, more interventionist center right person, but not typically in the same ways that people on the center left would be interventionist.
Liberal capitalism is, the important thing to know is that the makers of this compass think that the classic left-right spectrum flattens things too much and obscures important differences between people who might look like they're at the same position if we were using a one-axis political spectrum. To correct this, the makers of the political compass have kept the left-right economic axis and added an authoritarian to libertarian axis. So now people who are for more free markets and more social freedoms, like the prototypical libertarian, are in the bottom right-hand quadrant instead of in the center. Plenty of other quizzes have utilized the four-quadrant model, sometimes making the y-axis more specifically about particular social issues rather than the kind of vague concept of authoritarianism. One criticism that the political compass has gotten before is that since all the quadrants are the same size, it can end up giving people the impression that people are evenly distributed through all four of the quadrants, which does not seem to be the case at all. Here's a graph from the voter study group on the 2016 electorate using a four-quadrant political compass. So what we can see is that there are some pretty clear clusters of Republican and Democratic beliefs, and while it isn't as simple as the basic one-axis political spectrum, there's absolutely a clear correlation between people's opinions on economics and their opinions on social issues. We can see a line of best fit here. People have also criticized the original political compass for being biased toward.
Yeah, I'd say that distribution is pretty close to correct. See, here's the thing, right? The MAGA movement obfuscates the views of so many of its adherents because, like, the core tenet of the MAGA movement is allegiance to Trump, allegiance and fealty to their God King, their God Emperor, whatever the hell you want to refer to him as. It is a cult, more. Uh, I should say more so than a political movement, because I would consider most cults to be political in some way, shape, or form. They direct the lives of their members in ways that, yeah, you would have to call political for sure. So it's very difficult to take seriously analyses on the views of Trump voters. Like, looking at this distribution, personally, I I I definitely take seriously the scattering of people on the left side of the economic spectrum, because there are a lot of people with what are traditionally considered left wing economic views who have sort of an incoherent. I don't want to say incoherent. They have left wing economic views and more authoritarian social views for sure, and even like here you are seeing a scattering of people who have more libertarian or non-interventionist social views in the Trump coalition, and that exists for sure. Um, but yeah, I'd say those views are incoherent with the way Trump governs. So personally, I would assume a lot more people would be more on the right. Actually, you know what? I think this probably is accurate. Like I it, it it is, yeah, I think that is accurate actually, because there are good uh amount of Trump people who I would say have more center left economic views, but are very authoritarian socially. I think that does make sense. Um, and that was always one of the major failures of the Republican Party, right? Because in reality, there are very few people with center right views of how the economy should be governed. I think, like coherently center right, I should say. They might have like vaguely center right views, but if you really interrogate them, they probably want the government to intervene to make sure there's a safety net, at least for certain types of people. Like they might be discriminatory in their views, but they definitely do want the government to ensure that people are provided for either when they fall in difficult times, or to have a sort of like baseline infrastructure in which everyone should exist if you really got down to brass tacks. Um, so you know what? Yeah, I would say this is probably pretty accurate. I think most Democrats are very uh, libertarian socially. Maybe not on their personal conduct, but definitely in their views of government intervention into people's lives, and the economic clustering on the middle of the left axis also makes sense as well. So you know what, yeah, sure, this does look pretty accurate. Let's go ahead and agree with this clustering here for sure.
Their opinions on social issues. We can see a line of best fit here. People have also criticized the original political compass for being biased towards the libertarian end from the compass. I don't know how we quantify that exactly, but take it for what it's worth. But speaking of being biased toward the libertarian end of the compass, let's talk about the next chart on our chart, the Nolan chart. The Nolan chart was created by a Libertarian Party activist named David Nolan, and it was really pioneering in the field of popularly accessible political quiz. It's distributed by the group Advocates for Self-Government and is billed as the world's smallest political quiz. It classifies people along two diagonal axes, a personal freedom axis and an economic freedom axis. The Nolan chart places libertarianism at the top of the chart, authoritarianism at the bottom, with liberal and conservative on the sides, and centrism in the middle. The Nolan chart is pretty straightforwardly a tool to try and convince people that they're actually libertarians. I think that's fair to say. Sorry, you guys. So it's on the aims to make a point side of my chart. The fact that it's intended to be taken so quickly makes it a good tool for activists that are talking to people on the street, trying to get them to take the quiz. If you see a libertarian group on a college campus or something, they may have a big version of one of these charts where they ask you to take the quiz and mark your placement on the chart. The idea is that a ton of people end up putting their little dot in the libertarian section. I saw a libertarian group do this at college one time. The inclusion of such a big centrist category is an interesting choice. It seems to imply that the ideologues of the four corners are all vying for control of this big center chunk. Moving on to our next diagram, we're very much in the aims to make a point side of things now. This is horseshoe theory, which is a political spectrum bent in the middle. So the far right and the far left ends are closer together than the moderate right and the moderate left, which makes the political spectrum look something like a horseshoe. The idea here is pretty simple. Let's imagine who would be on the far left and the far right of a traditional political spectrum. People like Stalin would be on the far left, and people like Hitler would be on the far right. Horseshoe theory says essentially that as totalitarian dictators, these people and their regimes actually had a lot in common with each other in practice. The idea of the horseshoe theory.
Yeah, I give a lot of credence to the horseshoe theory because even though the stated ideologies of the far left and the far right are uh, pretty diametrically opposed, the outcomes you end up seeing, uh, even though they're carried out under very different pretenses, end up really quite similar. With you do tend to end up with a lot of hierarchical distribution of goods on the far left, whether they want to admit it or not. They have favored classes, they have they form elite cadres, they violate people's rights, they scapegoat ethnic and religious minorities almost in equal measure as right-wing movements. Um, they just do it using different terminology and justifications and different processes. They might have more of a sort of formal process of adjudication, but or they might do it through less through like force and direct violence, and more through deprivation. uh but at the end of the day, you do end up first otherizing otherizing and geez, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, okay, let's just go with otherizing minorities and using that as a justification to either deprive them or exact violence against them, or contain them, confine them. Uh, Very much the same as far right ideologies. So, yeah, the horseshoe theory is, I think, pretty well proven at this point in history, given a lot of the convergence in forms of violence of far right and far left uh, governments throughout the 20th century.
Is used as a warning against extremism, but it's also used by people who like to theorize about new coalitions forming in politics between the far left and the far right. These so-called horseshoe coalitions are brought up by some as an example of the potential or even already occurring political realignment. Some of the things that I've seen people cite horseshoe theory to describe include the praise that some on the far left have given figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene. A less extreme example might be the
Yeah, that's also another aspect of the horseshoe theory. You can like sort of negatively, normatively load it against people who reside on the political extremes, but it can also be used as a political propaganda tool for people on the extremes by saying, "Hey, we have more in common than the establishment figures, than those who hoard the resources of society and use order as a tool of subjugation." So. Yeah, the horseshoe theory is useful for people who have very different goals as far as um, what they want to achieve with it normatively.
alliance between Congressman Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie on the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Massie has a reputation as a fairly dogmatic libertarian, and Khanna was one of the Sanders campaign national co-chairs in 2020. If you're interested in either of these things, I've made a video about the Marjorie Taylor Greene situation and about Thomas Massie's primary defeat both recently. Go check these videos out if you haven't seen them. There's all sorts of different things like the horseshoe theory. One you may have seen before is the so-called ratchet effect, which is, depending on if you're seeing it from a left-wing or right-wing source, claims that liberals move everything to the left and Republicans stop movement back to the right, or that conservatives move everything to the right and that Democrats stop movement back to the left. The point of the ratchet effect idea is to rally people against one of the parties by claiming that it's not ideological enough or isn't doing enough to fight back against the other party. The last one of these types of diagrams that I have here in this quadrant is the fishhook theory, which is attempting to make the case that centrists are much closer to the far right than they are to the far left. The idea is that centrists are complicit.
That's an interesting one. I've heard that argued, obviously, rhetorically a lot by leftists, but never seen it visualized uh, like that. Never heard of the fishhook theory before. So that's a really interesting visual representation of the concept that's posited by a lot of people on the far left. I hate a lot of the arguments. Like, anyone who lives in the United States can see the very obvious differences between the way states are governed by people who you'd even consider on the center right versus people on the center left. Talk of states are governed by people on the far right versus the center left. So you have to basically exist in an environment purely sculpted by propaganda to even believe something like this fishhook theory.
In enabling the far right, basically. It's a critique of centrists by the far left. It also functions as a critique of a particular kind of pundit. Leave me a comment letting me know who you're thinking of if this sounds familiar to you, that likes to talk a big game about being a centrist and independent or listening to all sides, but in practice, pretty much always ends up falling in line behind the right wing. I know a lot.
I feel like that's a much different phenomena than people on the far left lumping the center left in with the center right or even the far right. That's a much different phenomena. That's like people who cloak themselves in the label of centrist, and not definitely not like center left specifically, and typically they would use language that aligns more with the center right, but then also push for policies that really align with the far right, and sort of attempt to shift the Overton window for the right using that rhetorical strategy. Um, but that's a lot different than what the far left does. I guess you could represent that visually in the same way, but the rhetoric, I would say, for those strategies are pretty different. Um, but yeah, I guess the fishhook is a decent metaphorical tool for either strategy.
A lot of people like to make fishhook theory type takes whenever any entertainer or a comedian or someone else turns out to be a right winger after previously supporting Democrats or the left. Frankly, I think the Occam's razor explanation for a lot of these why I left the left cases, at least for people who aren't explicitly political pundits, is that they just got older and richer and started hanging out mostly with other older, richer people. People, especially people without deep ideological commitments or a particular interest in politics, might just end up changing their political opinions if they're around more people of a particular political opinion. I'm sure we've all seen this happen in life before. But anyway, let's move on to our next chart, the Sapley Values Quiz. The Sapley Values Quiz adds an extra dimension of progressive and conservative to the standard authority and economy axes. This makes it slightly more complicated than the classic political compass, but potentially more informative, maybe. This also marks the first time, but definitely not the last time in this video, that we're going to be seeing a chart that applies the same logic to the political compass that the political compass applied to the basic left-right spectrum, which is that it's not capturing all the relevant dimensions of politics, and this is a problem that can be solved by adding another dimension.
I guess you could be a progressive authoritarian. I guess that's how a lot of people would describe sort of like the woke Twitter era, like cancel culture. Yeah, that would be a progressive authoritarian. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Because I was going to say, like, how can you be progressive and but I often make this critique of the term progressive because it's such a nebulous term. I tend to invoke this sort of esoteric example of the I believe it was 1914 president, it was either 1912 or 1914 presidential election, where all three major candidates labeled themselves progressives. You had Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all running as progressives when their ideologies were not remotely aligned in the least. Um, so yeah, I think that's a valid organization. Yeah, for sure. Give me 1 second. Have to step away.
You'll
Yeah.
see what I'm talking about more
Okay.
whenever we get to the 8 values test. But I think a problem that test makers or people interested in trying to map ideology have to face up to eventually is, am I trying to make things more accurate, or am I just making them more complicated and granular? Politics isn't something that's done alone. At a certain point, if you're taking these tests and assigning yourself an incredibly niche ideology like anarcho-primitivist, eco-monarchist or something, you're not really doing politics anymore, right? You've assigned yourself a label so
Yeah, exactly. There always has to be a utilitarian bent to the game of politics. You are attempting to convince people to follow your ideology, latch onto your beliefs, your goals, and enact them by, you know, taking the resources of society and putting them in the direction that you're advocating for. And when you get to that degree of granularity or lose ability to advocate in I guess, plain spoken way that is accessible to large segments of the population, that you're sort of failing a core goal of politics. Of course, you can create these tools to appeal to sort of the, I guess, tastemakers or the core of your ideological adherence. And then you could simplify it further later on. So you can establish a very granular platform and then sort of craft the rhetorical tools that you use to sort of disseminate that platform to the broader public so it can have utility that way. But yeah, these political compasses tend to be more either propaganda or rhetorical tools than for sort of creating a platform on which adherents to a particular ideology can disseminate their beliefs. So yeah, they should have a certain degree of accessibility as the goal. So yeah, that makes sense as a critique.
granular that it's really just like you and a couple other people in a Discord server somewhere. That's not really politics anymore. But we'll get back to that later. Next, I want to talk about another concept called the Overton window. Depicted here by my fantastic little drawing of a window, we can see that the Overton window obscures the ends or extremes of the left-right spectrum. The Overton window makes the crucial point that not all points on the political spectrum are relevant at any given time. In American politics, if someone ran for president as a Soviet-style communist, they would be generally considered to be a fringe unserious candidate. This is because those beliefs are way far outside the Overton window of what's acceptable in politics right now. But of course, the window of what's politically acceptable can change over time. We can see this happening pretty clearly with an issue like gay marriage. In 2004, Bush was pushing for a constitutional amendment to define marriage as between one man and one woman. In 2008, Obama had to hem and haw about how he didn't support gay marriage, but he supported civil union.
With respect to gay marriage, I do not support gay marriage, but I support a very strong version of civil unions where I think the state has to recognize the same rights and responsibilities.
In 2015, the Supreme Court decision Obergefell v. Hodges.
Now, okay, over there, so you have the concept of the Overton window, and whenever you talk about the Overton window, you can also talk about obscured positions. So I don't think most people seriously believe that Obama was opposed to gay marriage, but there is a certain degree of political utility you obtain by obscuring your actual positions to the broader public and then attempting to shift people's views or what they're willing to enact through society once you have the power to advocate more forcefully through being either elected or appointed representative of whatever aspect of the political system you inhabit. So, there is utility in engaging in some degree of obfuscation to then later shift the Overton window more to your actual beliefs. So I think most people recognize that's what Obama was doing there. Now, when you do that, you kind of open yourself up to attacks from people who call themselves more pure adherents of the direction you're leaning in politically. So a lot of people who think the center left or center right are just basically playing the game of politics to maintain power can say, hey, look, they are just sort of taking all this political energy that would be actually best directed further in our direction, further towards our side of the political spectrum, and wasting it in maintaining this sort of establishment mode of politics and keeping the true will of the people from being represented, or not using the power that's been vested in them to move the people in the direction that they should go. But everyone knows that you have to obscure a certain amount of your goals politically, because not necessarily because they'd be harmful to the society, but because it's difficult to find the rhetorical space to negotiate those beliefs in public without having the platform to enact this. And the people on the extremes know this. They engage in this practice themselves, but they cynically attack people closer to the center for engaging in these tactics.
Ruled that same-sex marriage was a constitutional right. And now in 2026, about 65% of Americans think that same-sex marriages should be valid. This is down from a peak of about 70% in 2022, but we can see just how much and how quickly public opinion shifted on this issue. Today, it would be considered a fairly extreme right-wing position to want to do something like nullify all gay marriages. This is an example of the Overton window of what's acceptable in politics shifting over time. The Overton window also...
Yeah, so that's an example of why it's useful to obscure your political beliefs, right? So on the campaign trail, you say, "Oh, I'm not in favor of gay marriage. I'm in favor of civil unions." Wink, wink. And you get into power, and you put people in place in the judicial system, or in a regulatory body to actually enact where you believe the society should be, and you facilitate shifting society in that direction. And then once people are living with the consequences of those changes and they're like, oh, hey, it's really not that bad, it didn't result in these like cataclysmic effects that I thought would take place, or it really made the lives of these people who were previously marginalized or excluded from certain societal benefits a lot easier. And then the positions of the broader public can shift after you've sort of facilitated the changes that you obscured by hiding your true beliefs. But, I think most true adherents of the philosophy to which you adhere would understand that that's what you're doing and wouldn't push for you to sort of unmask your actual position before you had the ability to facilitate it coming to fruition in some way, shape, or form.
forces us to think about the relevance of what we're doing in politics. If your positions are way outside of what's politically acceptable in your society, you're probably not going to have all that much luck winning elections. You probably have to start smaller, thinking about how to persuade people that what you believe is acceptable before you can have success in the electoral realm. The last thing in this quadrant of my chart is the moral foundations test. This
Again, yeah, you can engage in persuasion, but a lot of the times you're better off just engaging in some degree of obfuscation. Again, the far left do this to a much greater degree than people in the center do this. Like, they do this to outrageous extents. People like Hassan Piker, he's always like, well, I just want healthcare, guys. You know, everyone should have healthcare. But everyone knows, well, I shouldn't say everyone knows, because you see a lot of mainstream journalists sort of whitewashing his positions and his image. But like I've said before, this dude has the politics of Pol Pot, literally. Like, he wants nothing more than influence and power. He does have genuine Marxist beliefs, but I honestly believe he would throw a good amount of those away to further cement his own influence. And if he could achieve a high degree of political power, he would throw away a lot of his beliefs to do so. Um, and you see this with a lot of his outbursts against groups that he says the Democratic Party supposedly doesn't do a good enough job representing. But he says oftentimes that those groups sort of need to set their issues aside in favor of pushing extremist, left-wing authoritarian uh, goals and advancing his left-wing authoritarian tactics.
test is based on the moral foundations theory, which is laid out most famously by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Moral foundations theory says that divides in our politics are essentially driven by divides over moral questions. Some of these divisions will be familiar to you from other political compasses like authority or liberty, but moral foundations tests also consider your thoughts on things like care, fairness, in-group loyalty, and purity. This version from IDR Labs will spit out your results compared to left liberals, conservatives, and libertarians on all the different moral foundation spectrums. This is an interesting take on a political test, I think, because it's trying to make politics about something more than just agreement with an ideology, which I think is a pretty reasonable thing to try and do, since most people are not super deep ideological thinkers. However, one concern that I always have when the moral foundations theory type stuff is brought up is how its proponents seem to talk about the modern left and right in ways that I think minimize how historically contingent these terms are. Okay, that was a lot of jargon, but for example, the right wing in American politics is generally protectionist on trade. In the past, the right wing in American politics was generally for free trade. Did a shift in the moral psychology of the masses happen between 1980 and 2016 that made this shift in public opinion happen? Another example might be anti-institutionalism. Haidt in his
I think you can make an argument that the right was less protectionist when the global south and countries that were previously considered unaligned or third world existed in states of extreme poverty. So there was a lot of benefit to American countries to have free trade. You could command really high prices for certain goods. You had disproportionate negotiating power. You could obtain imports extremely cheaply and still have a lot of manufacturing domestically. Now that a lot of countries have built the infrastructure to take on a lot of the entirety of the manufacturing process themselves, instead of just exporting raw materials to the US to be processed and built into a final product with most of the added value, then you could say that, okay, it's not really that the goals of the right have changed, but it's the utility of free trade in achieving those goals has diminished. So that's why you see a lot of right-wing parties becoming more protectionist. So I think that would be a pretty good steel man for the reasons why a lot of right-wing parties have shifted from being more oriented to free trade to being oriented toward protectionism. And you could say the same about left-wing parties, because you could say a lot of left-wing parties viewed free trade as protecting the power of capital to command the lowest price for the manufacturing process and the highest margin. Um, it was primarily a tool of exploitation of the poor, uh, and preserve the sort of disproportionate relationships and negotiating power of more developed countries and Western aligned countries against unaligned countries or the global South, whatever you want to call most nations that suffered the degradations of colonialism or bore the brunt of the consequences of the world wars and the battles between great powers of the 19th and 20th century. Now, there are a lot of those countries have a lot more economic power, and they aren't quite equal negotiating powers, but they can dictate a lot more terms than they could previously. You see a lot more people on the center left, at least, open to more open trade, more free trade. They view it as less of a zero sum game and more of something that has benefits for both parties, which can be pretty hard to push domestically. But I think there's a good argument for free trade and open trade in the current world, benefiting all parties involved in trading agreements.
Famous TED Talk on moral foundations theory talks about the conservative impulse to preserve institutions.
The great conservative insight is that order is really hard to achieve, it's really precious, and it's really easy to lose. So as Edmund Burke said, the restraints on men, as well as their liberties.
Liberals speak for the weak and oppressed, want change and justice even at the risk of chaos. That's an interesting view. I do think liberals speak for the weak and oppressed, but I don't think liberals would want to risk chaos. I think liberals would advocate more for what people call ordered liberty. So they want to bend the institutions towards the goal of achieving positive outcomes for the weak and oppressed. You do have people who are on the further left who want to destroy institutions and level things for people that way. But I don't think it's I don't think that's accurate to say liberals want change and justice at the risk of chaos at all.
Are to be reckoned among their rights. This was after the chaos of the French Revolution.
How does this square with a conservative movement that seems to be interested in overturning or destroying long-established institutions? Now,
so that squares with a conservative movement that wants to overturn institutions, because conservatism is not only conservative, it's in the name, but it also tends towards reactionary politics when liberal institutions sort of achieve the goal of pointing institutions in the direction of distributing power more evenly towards society. I believe there's something inherent to the conservative mindset of preferring hierarchies of people. Conservatives inherently view people as unequal. They view some people as more deserving of exercising power, even at cost to their own material conditions, as people like to say, or their own benefits. So that's why you often see a lot of people confused as to how Trump supporters can advocate for his policies despite seeing the very real and immediate cost of them. It's almost cartoonish how quickly a lot of Trump's policies result in negative outcomes for people. You typically don't see policies have such immediate and stark results, but his followers still support him anyway because they value that hierarchy more than they value positive outcomes for their own lives. So you can say that it's strange that conservatives oppose institutions, but conservatives opposed institutions in the wake of the Civil War because those institutions were bent towards providing equality for the formerly enslaved and for Black people who were just made full citizens of the United States. And once they raised those institutions, they then quickly erected institutions bent towards segregation and subjugation that lasted for the next 100 years.
Moral foundations theory proponent, I think, would say, and there's some merit to this, in my opinion, that an argument was made on the basis of moral foundations that changed people's mind on these issues. So, for example, Trump's protectionist arguments were part of a larger story he told about protecting Americans from foreigners, which gels very nicely into other conservative moral foundations. But I would just caution people against aggressively.
Yeah, you could say that, but I think key thing you're leaving out here is conservative tendency toward hierarchy. Like they value hierarchy above almost every other value because they view hierarchies as natural, as innately ordered. They view any attempt to subvert hierarchies as unnatural, as tending away from what either God or nature or whatever justification they use has intended for humanity. So that's a critical component to conservative opposition to liberal institutions.
Post hoc rationalizing things this way, you can tell a Just So story about how almost any policy position tracks one of the moral foundations from a liberal or conservative perspective. But if you start doing that, I think you're not really learning about why people have certain politics. You're just trying to make politics fit this theory. Onto our complicated and sorting quadrant. First, we have one that's somewhat new to me, but I've seen it a lot lately, so here it is. Ideology map. Ideology map is a very slick looking political test that'll sort you into one.
So I took this test. I view myself as a liberal technocrat, I guess like a socially democratic liberal technocrat. But so I got pretty close to scoring high on the liberal technocrat aspect of this test, but it ended up grouping me as a social democrat. And I think a major flaw in this test is that it views sort of laissez-faire economic perspective as technocratic. So, as in, you trust, if you're a liberal technocrat, this test would say, okay, you trust government institutions to maintain order in their domain, and you trust private actors to maintain order in their domain, and you just sort of maximally let various aspects of society function fully within their node of expertise. But it doesn't really take into account that both sides of the spectrum have regulatory bodies. So it asks questions about regulation of private actors, but it doesn't ask questions about regulation of public actors. Like you have government workers whose job it is to regulate corporations, regulate pollution, to make sure people aren't being abused by private actors. But you also have inspector generals and other regulatory organizations and frameworks that monitor the behavior of public employees. So it didn't really incorporate that into the test. So it would take someone like me who has a largely technocratic view of both sides of the ledger and just sort of shove you into the purely social democratic category. Although I should say it wasn't purely social democratic because the next highest category I got was liberal technocrat. But I think it's important to have checks and balances on both public and private actors to sort of ensure that they're achieving the intended goals or playing the intended roles that we want them to in society.
Of 17 categories, a mix of more generalized or vague categories like centrist.
So pause for a second so you can see all the categories here. So yeah, I definitely tended to the technocrat and social democratic categories, not democratic socialists, because democratic socialists view capitalism as inherently wrong, but they don't want to achieve socialism through authoritarian means. So, okay, it does have the authoritarian left category. Yeah. Yep. So I definitely skewed toward technocrat and social democratic categories based on the categories in this test.
Or left populist, along with more traditional ideological categories like social democrat or democratic socialist. They break things down on 5 axes: economic, social, civil liberties, governance, and system trust, and then convert this into a more general 2-axis political compass that we're all familiar with. I like the fact that this test includes some novel spectrums. System trust and governance especially seem like facets of modern politics that used to be somewhat overlooked by these kinds of political quizzes. Ideology map explains the system trust axis by saying, do you broadly trust that elections, media, courts, and science are functioning legitimately? Or do you think that the system is fundamentally rigged in favor of the powerful? This separates populists from institutionalists across both left and right. Governance, on the other hand, is basically talking about internationalism versus nationalism. It's measuring your perspective on things like alliances and international agreements more broadly. I think,
yeah, definitely scored pretty high in both of those categories for that test.
These are both clearly very salient issues in modern politics. This year is the 10th anniversary of the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote, probably the two most enduring symbols of the system trust and governance issues, respectively. Ideology Map will also tell you which countries have politics that are most similar and most different to you. I won't tell you which ones are most similar to me. You can guess that in a comment, but the two furthest away from me were North Korea and Afghanistan. Next up, we have another classic with 8 values. It does exactly what it says. It sorts you into a political group based on how you score on 4 different spectrums that include 8 different values. I won't read them all out. Here they are on the screen. Based on your results, the 8 values test will sort you into one of a whopping 52 ideologies, all the way from anarcho-capitalism to anarcho-communism. I promised I'd come back to this point earlier, so
I haven't taken this test before. Seems interesting, I guess.
let me just say, I don't know if there's a ton of utility in adopting a super niche ideology based on the results of an internet quiz, especially if you're actually interested in real life politics. If you want to read about the theories of obscure political philosophers, more power to you. I think that kind of stuff is fun too. But please don't confuse calling yourself a theocratic distributist with having actual politics relevant to the real world. One other tiny critique that I would like to make of this kind of ideological label
So a theocratic distributist, that would, I guess, be like a Christian Democrat or a Muslim Brotherhood adherent type person. So someone who believes in a fairly generous welfare state and strong social safety nets, but also believe society should be ordered around whatever their religious, predominant religious ideology is. Yeah.
sorting test is that it sort of separates people from the social and cultural context of particular ideologies. For example, online, it's pretty popular for people to call themselves social democrats because they took a test and that's what the test said. And, you know, fair enough. But it's also important to remember that social democracy, in addition to supporting various concrete policies, also connotes an entire history and context that most people in the United States do not have or understand even remotely. It makes sense to people online, and I think, you know, in places where people know what that means, it might be fine to use. But if I were to call myself a social democrat to someone in real life, you know, like an average voter, they would not know what that means. They would probably think that I was saying that I was a socialist in real life, you know.
Yeah, social. Yeah, I don't. I think I share that belief. I wouldn't ever really call myself a social democrat in real life. Uh, Partially because I think most people who are strong adherents of social democracy would be members, not in like the sense of wanting to accomplish the goals that would be formally stated under social democracy, but are like ideologically committed to the label, would be members of the DSA, at least in its previous incarnation. It's since been taken over by diehard socialists and communists, as we're seeing from a lot of the candidates who are running under its banner the last few years. But yeah, I think you have to convey the importance of the label of liberal, especially within the American context. It has a very strong history stemming from the progressive era and the abolitionist movement, all the way up through FDR and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, to sort of exemplify that you can adhere to the tenets of the broader liberal movement while still enabling strong government support for individuals.
Like an average voter, they would not know what that means. They would probably think that I was saying that I was a socialist Democrat, or maybe that I was a particularly social Democrat. I don't know. They would not know what it means. This is because in the United States, the ideology that supports things like a robust welfare state and strong public investment grew out of liberalism with FDR's New Deal. This is why a lot of people in the United States still use liberal as a synonym for left. Contrast this with European social democracy, which grew out of a reformist vision of socialism that decided that revolution was not the only path to change. Even though New Deal liberalism and social democracy might arrive at similar policy prescriptions on paper, they have very different historical and social contexts. The problem is that these are not necessarily things that...
Yeah, I would agree with that categorization of the two labels, for sure.
A political test can measure for. So anyway, don't let me tell you what to call yourself. If social democrat or whatever else most accurately describes your ideology, and if other people understand what you mean, by all means, go ahead. But I think we should just keep in mind whenever we're taking these ideological sorting tests that there's more to ideology than just a set of political positions or preferences. Ideologies are products of a particular cultural and social context. The 8 values test has also spawned a whole subgenre of values tests. There's versions with 12 axes, there's left values, there's right values. The values extended universe is very large. If you think that the problem with the political compass is that there's not enough specificity, you will find a test in the values extended universe that fits your needs. The final thing that I'm mentioning in this quadrant actually isn't a chart at all. It's the concept of political compass balls. If you're unfamiliar, Polkump ball takes the concept of the popular Poland ball memes, which basically use stereotypes of countries in ball form to make comics, and applies this general frame to political ideologies. Here's one of the top posts from the Polkump ball subreddit, which shows the anarchist ideology balls. You can tell they're anarchist because of the diagonal black section on them, and they're voting out the anarcho-capitalist ball in Among Us. The meme here is basically saying that the rest of the anarchists don't consider the anarcho-capitalist to be a real anarchist. That's why they're being voted out as the imposter in Among Us. This meme is very prototypical of the Polkump ball style because it's basically indecipherable to a normal person and requires so much niche knowledge to even begin to understand the joke. You have to have knowledge of the beef between left-wing anarchists and anarcho-capitalists. You have to have knowledge of what all these political colors mean. You have to know what the game Among Us is and how its mechanics work. This subculture, I think, is more like political fandom than actual politics. There's a ball that describes every conceivable political position: socialism ball, technocracy ball, eco-anarchism ball, classical liberalism ball. But I won't be too hard on the ball fandom. Some of them are pretty funny, and I think it's probably mostly kids who are into this based on the kinds of comments that I see on posts about Polkump ball. But this is just a reminder that at a certain point, infinite divisions of ideologies into smaller and smaller ideologies is less about gaining a better understanding of politics and more about entertainment. On to our final quadrant, quizzes that aim to sort people while at the same time remaining pretty simple. First up is the Pew Political Typology Quiz. Pew did a similar typology in 2021 that's interesting to look at from a historical perspective, but the one that I'm talking about right now is very new. It came out this month. It divides Americans into 9 categories: the no apologies right, the faith-first conservatives, the unconventional right, the pragmatic and polite right, the tuned-out middle, the order and opportunity left, the left-out left, the loyal liberals, and the leftward progressives. The quiz itself is very short, only 24 questions. It's unique among these tests because none of its categories are actual ideology. Nobody actually calls themselves a loyal liberal or a member of the pragmatic and polite right. What Pew is attempting to do here is take a snapshot of the electorate's main naturally occurring groupings. You might disagree.
Those are pretty interesting categories. I think they're pretty intuitive. Like, you read those names and you can sort of see what they're trying to get at. Like, I see the label loyal liberal and I instantly be like, yeah, okay, I definitely identify with that label, and I understand the like order and opportunity liberals label. Like, that would probably be someone like Ben Shapiro. Did I say Ben Shapiro? I meant Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, you know, some of those center-left politicians who would more strongly identify with the label of center and say, oh, we just need to get things done and not really invoke the ideological precepts of left liberalism so much, and are more interested in sort of appealing to wherever the broader populace is at and maintaining a sense of law and order, but also not really abandoning the goals of the left liberal movement, but sort of like de-emphasizing their importance in daily governance, you know.
With how they do this, how they make the exact divisions, I mean, but I think I like how the Pew test tries to capture the vibes of the various big political groupings. I also like how this chart shows you which groups are bigger and smaller. By far, the biggest group is the order and opportunity left, which supports economically liberal policies. That's liberal in the American sense, to be clear, while at the same time being concerned about things like crime and immigration. I also appreciate Pew for not trying to philosophize too much on what motivates the tuned-out middle. They describe this 9% of the public by saying that the tuned-out middle is politically divided and has an exceptionally low level of interest in politics, which I think is definitely more accurate than what passes for centrism at the elite level.
Yeah, that is almost certainly accurate.
Some complicated blend of highly technical policy suggestions. Our last quiz is I Side With, which again does exactly what it says it does. It asks you a bunch of policy questions, and then at the end it tells you which politicians agree with your perspective the most. I Side With is unique for its other stances feature, which allows people to capture a little more nuance with their answers to the questions. I do find I Side With's choices for parties pretty dubious, because for most Americans, a lot of the parties listed here won't even be an option that they can actually vote for. The Elon Musk America Party, like, I'm not even sure actually exists in a meaningful way, and No Labels in practice seems to just support moderate candidates that they like in both parties.
I don't think Andrew Yang ever made a party. Like, the Forward Party or Forward Movement wasn't really so much of a party as it was a sort of like politician ranking system. So it wouldn't really organize in and of itself. It would just sort of identify politicians who it viewed as pragmatic and oriented toward what they conceived of as moving America forward, quote unquote, regardless of Party. And No Labels obviously is a attempt to sort of synthesize sort of more centrist oriented vision. Like it calls itself No Labels, but it's definitely a decidedly centrist organization with people like Joe Manchin and Michael Steele sort of forming the ideological, I guess, waypoints that you could uh, use to categorize the party or movement or whatever. Um, I think No Labels probably played a negative role in the leading up to the 2024 election. Definitely helped to play a key role in undermining people's faith in the Biden administration and the effectiveness of Biden as a president, which is why I really didn't like it. And it sort of de-emphasized the severity of the gripes people had with either end of the mainstream political spectrum. Like you had Donald Trump, who tried to literally overthrow the government, and Biden, who people thought was too old and didn't deal with inflation quickly enough. You know, it's like, and sort of attempting to sort of say, oh, neither side is meeting your needs, just sort of really downplays the severity of whatever issues might exist with either party. Like, I view the Republican Party as effectively defunct and destructive to the American project. And whatever your gripes with the Democratic Party are, I don't think any good faith actor could say the same about the Democratic Party.
Parties. I hope by going through all these quizzes and charts and graphs and diagrams, you've been able to think about what makes a good political quiz, the assumptions and biases that go into creating political quizzes and charts. And I hope you've also learned a little about the history of how our favorite Gen Z political science tool came to be. Leave me a comment and let me know what your favorite political test is. Let me know what I missed. Subscribe to the channel, like the video. I also want to say thank you so much to all my channel members. You make this possible. If you want to become a channel member, you can hit join on this video or on my channel page and get your name in the credits. See you next time.
Okay, that's a pretty cool video. Yeah, it makes sense to sort of like categorize all the different political compasses and their goals and their utility and maybe the biases inherent to each one, because there is always going to be a bias regardless of how objective political compass tries to be. I think the best one would be was it the ideology map? No, that wasn't it. What was it called? The one that
Map explains the system trust
yeah,
axis by
okay, it was
saying
the ideology map. Yeah, I think
ideology
that's
map
the
is a very
best,
slick looking political
yeah, I think this is the best political compass test I've taken for sure. It covers the most. It achieves a good compromise between granularity and utility that I think a lot of the political compasses lack. And it also sort of like attempts to pair you with actual political figures and countries based on, you know, where your answers fit on their test. So I think it's pretty useful for sure. All right. So next, I wanted to take a look at the populism video. Now, I've already watched this, so a lot of my opinions on this I've already sort of formulated, but I think it'd be useful to sort of go through it and talk through the video at the same time.
For a certain kind of liberal, the worst thing you can be in the whole world is a populist.
The populism in the West.
I wouldn't say that's the worst thing, but it's definitely not something you'd want to be categorized at for sure for a lot of liberals.
Why do we see a rise of populism?
Whether or not this style of politics is ethical, it's certainly democratic, and it goes by the name of populism.
I think liberals have become too afraid of populism, and it's actually destroying us. An excessive fear of appearing populist denies the long history of liberals from the very beginning, making populist appeals in order to achieve liberal ends. It confuses us.
So, okay, so he's using the term populist here, where a lot of people would just say popular, you know, broadly oriented, mass appeal. I don't think populist is the same as having mass appeal. I guess I could sort of, well, he doesn't exclusively use it to mean mass appeal. He'll sort of go further into his definition of populist, but yeah, the way he invokes it here definitely has implication of mass appeal.
Style of politics for the substance of politics. It makes liberals talk and act like elitists. It puts Democrats in danger of missing some massive opportunities this election season. And frankly, an excessive fear of sounding like populists prevents liberals from speaking honestly about our current political situation. So lots to cover, but first, what even is populism? Populism is a funny word. It's applied to people across the ideological spectrum, from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump and lots of others too. The short answer is that populism is a kind of politics that aims to represent the interests of average people against a controlling or elite class. How exactly the...
Yeah, and I don't think that definition is particularly accurate, and it, like I said earlier, it sort of wipes away a lot of the normative baggage in the term populist. It's like defining murder as killing someone. There's a normative weight to the word murder that the word killing doesn't convey. Like, if you are a murderer, you've been adjudicated by your society as having killed someone unjustifiably. Like, a killing isn't automatically a murder. Like, you can kill in self-defense, you can kill someone in furtherance of some military objective. None of those would be categorized as murder. But if you say, okay, murder is when you kill somebody, yeah, no, that doesn't really capture the full extent of the definition of murder. And there's an inherent negative loading to the word murder. Like, the word killing definitely has a negative connotation, but I would say there is a way there can't be any sort of positive connotation to the word murder, where the word killing could be justified. You could have a justified killing, but you can't say there's like a justified murder. That's just like an oxymoronic statement, inherently contradictory. So I'll get more into my definition of the word populist later, but I just sort of wanted to put that out there right from the beginning.
People and the elite are defined is what makes the difference between different kinds of populism: leftist populism, right-wing authoritarian populism, et cetera, et cetera. The key here is that populism itself is not an ideology. It's a style of politics that can be applied to really almost any kind of ideology. But one ideology that's almost never associated with populism today is liberalism. You never hear anyone talk about liberal populism. This is so much the case that you'll sometimes hear liberals speak about populism as if it's an ideology directly opposed to liberalism, or at least mutually exclusive.
But okay, here's the thing. Even so, one thing that people often ascribe to liberalism is that liberal ideologies tend not to have outgroups. I wouldn't say they have no outgroups, and that might be something I get into later. But populism inherently postulates outgroups in ways that I believe are contradictory to most conceptions of liberalism, or to most liberal projects in the real world. So, yeah, squaring that circle is, I would say, kind of difficult to do. That doesn't mean you don't identify people who are causing problems or ideologies that are problematic in the society. But when you categorize someone as an outgroup, I guess you say that means they're sort of excluded from the protections or the positive goals of your political project in some way, shape, or form. So I guess that's what, like, liberal populism feels kind of contradictory, not to the same degree as saying like a justified murder or something, but there is a sort of contradictory aspect there.
Exclusive with liberalism. This clip of Derek Thompson, co-author of Abundance with Ezra Klein, is one example of what I'm talking about here.
If the lens of corporate power leads to both some very good ideas and some not very good ideas, then it might not be the single best lens through which to see improving America. I am not a populist. I am a liberal.
Now, he's saying populism to mean left-wing populism there, but here's the economist pitching populism as the fundamental challenge to liberalism today, using right-wing examples.
In recent years, populist movements have attacked the liberal cause.
It's a pretty common theme. The anxiety about populism of all stripes runs very deep in the liberal popular consciousness. If you're in this space at all, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Liberalism is an ideology committed to things like freedom, equality, brotherhood, fraternity, as the French put it, and the rule of law. Given all that, is there anything in liberalism that prevents us from making populist appeals? I know one man who didn't think so. A little over 250 years ago, one of the great liberals in history, Thomas Paine, wrote in his most famous work, Common Sense, that one honest man is worth more than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived.
Okay, but that's ascribing a sort of behavioral component to the wealthy. Now, I don't know if implied there is that wealth is inherently corrupting and therefore having a crown inherently makes you a ruffian, but that's a little bit difficult because liberalism is directly opposed to any form of authoritarianism. So like I don't think there's any liberal society that could tolerate a monarch or any such authority figure that actually wielded power. Like you could say, oh, like, we have a liberal society in like the Netherlands or the UK, but I think their monarchs are largely figureheads. Like they have the title of head of state, but even within that role, they operate largely ceremonially, and they would have a foreign minister, uh, which would be the equivalent of the Secretary of State in the U.S. that actually serves that role. So I think there's a that's a bit of an overwrought example, in my opinion.
I think that's just about as populist as you can get in 1776. In that spirit, let's move beyond liberalism's birth in the Age of Enlightenment and consider another time that liberalism was in crisis.
Economic royalists carved new dynasties. New kingdoms were built upon concentration of control over material things. Through new uses of corporations and banks and securities, new machinery of industry and agriculture, of labor and capital, all undreamed of by the fathers, the whole structure of modern life was impressed into this royal service.
Of course, that was FDR at his 1936 Democratic Convention speech. FDR.
Okay. Let me see. Does that really qualify as a populist speech? Like, liberalism is opposed to concentration of all sorts of resources in society. It's opposed to concentration of wealth. It's opposed to concentration of power. It's opposed to concentration of any form of capital. So, you could say that a speech against concentration and the people who facilitate that is anti-elite, or but um, it's like it's not elite in a generic sense, and it's not really against you know it's not really against the concept of a certain, like, having like a strata of people who have some degree of wealth that's more than the rest of society. um trying like he's not really invoking, like he is invoking moneyed elite, but he's not really invoking them as a category that is pitched against the broader populace. He's more invoking the negative effects of the concentration of wealth, and sort of the behaviors and stagnation that promotes. Um, and there are people who would want to preserve that. And would you say that that's inherently attacking the people who want to preserve that status quo? Um, I don't know.
Is responsible for liberalism gaining its modern associations in the United States, and he was very populist. His populism also helps to broaden the scope of what liberals believed could be possible. He extended the ideas of the American Revolution by pointing out that people who are desperately poor are not really meaningfully free, especially relevant for our current situation where the illiberal right brazenly cooperates globally to try and undermine democratic societies. FDR also understood what he was doing as an effort to push back against global tyranny.
Okay, so before we go further, I just want to look at the dictionary definition of populism. So, a political philosophy or movement that represents or is claimed to represent the interests of ordinary people against the establishment, right? So, would FDR consider himself not a part of the establishment? I think he was very much an establishment figure, and he created a lot of what we would consider the modern establishment. Now, you could argue that the establishment at the time was controlled by the moneyed elites. There wasn't really much of a federal institution that advocated the interests of the common person. Um, so I guess if that's your definition of populism, then you could say, okay, yeah, FDR sort of inherently invade in a populist manner. Uh, General concern for ordinary people. Okay, interesting. I've never seen that definition of populism before. Okay. I really don't I really don't know if I agree with those definitions of populist. Um, okay. So here's the thing, right? I think populism has inherent negative valence, okay? Because I think populism uh, inherently invokes the popular will against certain classes of people as having an inherent anti-majoritarian or amoral or immoral bent that is not really a result of social incentives. It's more so a result of like a sort of moral or normative deficiency, and that sort of class of people needs to be deconstructed or destroyed in order for power to be distributed among people, or in order for the people to express their will in a way that solves for the ills of society. And it often posits the embodiment of those ills in a very narrowly cast group of people. You know, populism, I don't think you can invoke a sort of systematic approach to solving societal problems through populism, for example. Like, I don't think there's any sort of systematic analysis that can be done through a populist lens. Um, because I think under populist political philosophy, you it inherently implies that there's a sort of like a simple bad guy who needs to have their power taken and given back to the people in order for most of society's ills to be solved. And I don't think that is really what liberalism posits. Like, there are people who stand in the way of the goals of liberalism, who hinder the sort of ideals of liberalism from being implemented.